The Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion was first pitched in 2012 by Kinder Morgan. The plan was to twin the existing pipeline, which runs from outside of Edmonton to Burnaby. That would triple the capacity from 300,000 barrels of oil per day to 890,000.
The Government of Canada has approved the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Expansion Project.
In 2016, Ottawa approved the project, but in the spring of 2017, the political landscape in BC changed. The NDP and Green Party reached a deal to form government and use, quote, every tool available to stop the expansion. Opposition, led by some Indigenous groups and municipalities, now had a strong ally in the province. Fed up with the forced delays, Kinder Morgan walked away from the project last year, and the Liberal government stepped in and bought it for $4.5 billion.
Our government's position is clear. It must be built, and it will be built.
Digging began in August, but days later, a federal court halted construction, ruling that the first review of the project was flawed and needed to be, in part, redone. The court pointed to inadequate consultations with Indigenous groups and an inadequate review of the project's effect on marine life. In February, the National Energy Board recommended approval for a second time, and the feds continued their consultations with Indigenous groups.
It is our government's responsibility to engage in a meaningful way, two-way dialogue, a sincere, serious dialogue with all Indigenous groups who are impacted.
Which brings us to today. The Trudeau cabinet has approved the Trans Mountain expansion for a second time. We're joined in Vancouver right now by Stockwell Day. Former Conservative cabinet minister, journalist Graham Thompson is with us from Edmonton. In Toronto, Tim Murphy, managing director of Macmillan Vantage, and in our Ottawa studio, political commentator and former NDP MP Françoise Boivin. Hi, everybody. Nice to see you. Stockwell, I'll start with you. Your take on the decision today. Some new things announced, like money, for example, generated by the pipeline going towards green energy projects.
Sure, we have to say that those of us who wanted to see this go ahead, we're obviously pleased with the announcement, and we can say, well, it took too long and there's other bills that are going to make things move slower. But, you know, this is a good announcement, and actually on your show right here, some of us, or well, one or two of us, have said consistently that this pipeline will help the environment, that this pipeline will in fact help First Nations. There are over 30 groups who are completely supportive of it, and it will send a positive signal. It's still going to take a while to get moving, but overall this is a good announcement, and let's just say maybe it was overdue, but we're glad to see it moving ahead.
Graham, what's the reception like in Alberta? And I'd point out that there are a lot of people saying that about the economic argument. There are a lot of people also criticizing. I mean, they would not agree with the assessment that it's going to be good for the environment. But Graham, what do you think?
Well, you just saw Premier Kenney. So, yes, you know, it's two thumbs up. They're happy with it. But this isn't going to help the Liberals politically in Alberta. It's just way too late for that. This is taking too long, even though it's a federal court of appeal that delayed this, you know, last August. I think the any sort of challenge, 16 challenges were defeated in court. The pipeline was going to go ahead. Then the Court of Appeal said no, put the brakes on it. Now it's going to go ahead. So no big surprise today. I think we were expecting this in Alberta. But again, you've got Kenney, now of course the Premier, saying, yeah, it's all great, but first of all, when will it start construction? You know, we've been led down this road for some time. It will be getting built. It hasn't been built yet. Still some skepticism. Been approved finally, but when will construction start? But even having said that, Kenney, of course, is basically on the campaign trail these days to defeat Trudeau and the federal Liberals in the October federal election.
Speaking of, sorry, I hate to interrupt you, I apologize. Speaking of people soon to be on the campaign trail, Federal Conservative Party leader Andrew Scheer just came up to the mic. He's responding to this decision here in Ottawa. Let's take a listen in.
There is never really any doubt. The real question today is, and the real question Justin Trudeau was unable to answer, is when will the Trans Mountain Pipeline actually get built? After approving the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion in 2016, the Trudeau Liberals failed to demonstrate the leadership and political will to get this pipeline built. By failing to exert federal jurisdiction, Justin Trudeau has ensured that we are in the exact same place as we were in 2016, way back when he approved this project the first time. Les nouvelles d'aujourd'hui ne devraient
Today's news should not be surprising. After all, this is the third time the Liberals approve this project. Everyone knows, or has known for months, that this was going to happen. The real question today, and the real question Justin Trudeau must answer this time, is when will this be built?
The Trans Mountain expansion was supposed to be operating this year. That turned out, like so many Liberal promises, to be not as advertised. And now we are going to miss another construction season. Now, before Justin Trudeau became Prime Minister, we had 3 private companies willing to invest more than $30 billion to build 3 nation-building projects that would have created tens of thousands of jobs and generated billions in economic activity. Those companies, Kinder Morgan, Enbridge, and TransCanada, continue to invest in pipelines, just not in Canada. But Trudeau let the radical anti-energy lobby get in the way of real action that will deliver economic benefit to the entire country. And with the project in jeopardy and with nowhere left to turn, the Liberal government purchased it with $4.5 billion in taxpayer dollars, $4.5 billion of your money. Now, this sent a devastating message to the world and the business community that the only way to get a big project built in Canada is to have the government nationalize it. Under the previous Conservative government, Canada saw 4 major pipelines built without a single cent of taxpayers' money, including one to Tidewater. Unfortunately, the Trudeau Liberals have done everything possible to get in the way of progress. Despite Liberal after Liberal approval, not a single inch of new pipeline has been laid on this project, and not a single ounce of dirt has been moved. And these delays have cost Canadians billions in economic activity. Today's cabinet decision gets us really no closer to having this vital job-creating project than we were when it was first approved 2.5 years ago. We all know what Justin Trudeau's real thoughts about Canada's oil and gas sector and Canada's oil and gas workers really are. Justin Trudeau said he wants to, quote, phase out Canada's oil and gas sector, and he smeared our workers in that industry. For once, for Trudeau, this is all going according to plan.
We all know what Justin Trudeau really thinks of the oil and gas sector and its workers in Canada. They want to eliminate the oil and gas sector in Canada, and they attack the reputation of construction workers. In reality, everything is going the way they want.
Canadian voters will be presented with a different choice. A different choice that will get pipelines built and deliver real economic benefit to our entire country. Canada's Conservatives will cancel the Trudeau carbon tax. We will repeal the No More Pipelines Bill C-69 and the oil export ban Bill C-48. Les conservateurs du Canada vont annuler.
Canada's Conservatives will cancel the Trudeau carbon tax. We will cancel the anti-pipeline bill, C-69, and C-48 against oil exploration.
Timelines for approvals, eliminate foreign interference in the approvals process, and invoke federal jurisdiction when it is in the national interest. Conservatives have gotten pipelines built in the past, and we will do it again. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Colleagues, I have my question list open. The première question, c'est Mathieu Goyer de Radio-Canada.
Mathieu Gagné, Radio-Canada. Good afternoon, Mr. Scheer. What would you have done different, given that the Federal Court of Appeal had sent the government back to the drawing board? What could you have done more? Well, the current government had different choices. Particularly, it had the opportunity to propose an amendment to the law to ensure that the analysis by Transport Canada could be used by the National Energy Board. It made another choice, redid the process from scratch, and that's what caused the great delays. The government was also asked to send all legal questions to the Supreme Court to determine the finality on all questions between different areas of jurisdictions and aspects of the law, and it decided not to do the two things we suggested. Mr. Trudeau clearly said that major energy projects and the environment would be the ballot question in the next election. What do you answer to that? What are you going to do to expose what you want on that front? Well, if Mr. Trudeau wants to battle the next election on what party can build pipelines and manage our environment, I'm really eager for that choice, because it's quite clear that it's the Conservative Party that has an excellent track record on both those fronts. We have had a situation where there have been 4 major pipelines built under our government, and at the same time, we implemented real measures to reduce emissions, and as I will announce tomorrow, we will have a lot to say about that. But Justin Trudeau's track record is that he canceled 2 pipelines, and now he's announced approval without really having any construction going on.
Mr. Scheer, you're being highly critical of the Prime Minister here today, even though this decision, he's going to take a beating with a lot of progressive voters who helped elect him in the last election, primarily to boost an economy in a part of the country that he has no hopes of making any kind of real gains. Why do you continue to doubt his sincerity on getting this project done? It seems like he can't take yes for an answer.
Well, I doubt his sincerity because he hasn't actually done anything. I mean, show me the pipeline. Where is it? He announced last year that it would be operating this year, and it's not. I don't believe he actually wants it built. He doesn't support our energy sector. I take him at his word when he travels around the world and talks about phasing out Canada's energy sector. Today's announcement, it doesn't get us any closer. He redid an entire process, spent a year redoing things that he could have handled in a much different way. And there's never any doubt that today's announcement isn't news. We all knew he was going to approve it. What Canadians were hoping for today was a clear timeline for construction to start, and he failed to be able to tell Canadians on what date construction would actually start. So today's announcement doesn't do anything for those Canadians who recognize the benefits of our energy sector, not just to Western Canada, but to people all throughout Canada who benefit from the richness and the prosperity that our natural resource sector brings to all Canadians.
The government has said that whatever profits, once this is built, if this is built, they'll funnel it into a clean energy transition. Is that a wise use of that money by the federal government?
Well, when we have a government track record that sends millions of dollars to multi-billion-dollar corporations, I look at that and I worry that that's just going to mean bigger checks to companies like Loblaws. We know that they love handing out big checks to their rich friends and picking winners and losers. I don't think Canadians are going to look at that and think that that's a wise use of their tax dollars.
Melanie Marquis, La Presse.
We have been watching federal Conservative Party leader Andrew Scheer respond to questions from reporters on the approval of the TMX pipeline expansion. The power panel has also been standing by, listening in. Stockwell Day, Graham Thompson, Tim Murphy, and Françoise Boivin. Tim, I'll start with you. The leader, Mr. Scheer's argument essentially seems to be we don't have a date on construction, and he doubts the sincerity of this decision by the federal government, particularly of the Prime Minister. He says he doesn't want to get the pipeline built, and his comments on phasing out fossil fuels in the past should we should take him at his word when he says that. What do you think of what Mr. Scheer's criticism is?
Well, I can't figure out whether he's being deliberately obtuse or doesn't actually understand how the law works, because at the end of the day, his main criticism is you don't coming to the table with a construction date. Well, one of the most important factors in this approval process, and the criticism of the last one, was effectively that in order for a consultation process to be real, you had to engage in that without prejudging the outcome. So guess what happens if you come to the table today and announce a construction timeline and a result and approvals all done and the package all tied up in a neat bow? Guess what the suspicion is? That you didn't actually consult with communities or engage in the process in good faith, and we are back into courts again. So the notion that we don't have a construction date today is an absurd and ridiculous criticism that actually is built on misunderstanding the law and what the courts said about the process. The government has been very careful to do this properly, to engage in a full consultation. Why? So that this actually survives the approval process and so they can get to construction. And look, I actually practice in the area of building big infrastructure projects, and the fact that you get an approval from an environmental assessment process does not mean you can put a shovel in the ground next day. You've got to go get a set of other permits. Even us, when we do a home, we got to go get a building permit before we can put a shovel in the ground, and there are a bunch of steps that need to be taken. And those are normal course. The company will run that process. So I think it's kind of an embarrassment, actually, the nature of his criticism, because he didn't really have much else to say. I think the government is clearly putting at risk some of the support it got in the last election. I thought that one of that reporter's question. I mean, look, there's unquestionably a set of people who are very critical of the government today, despite the fact that it said we're going to try and balance both economic growth and the environment. And I think the government is sincerely trying to do that.
Françoise, what do you think? I mean, I take Tim's point definitely around the construction season and all the criticism that happened in the past. The Prime Minister did say that that there would be shovels this season, this construction season, but just sort of the saliency of will that argument resonate? There are, I think, a lot of people perhaps who are depending on that pipeline or looking towards that pipeline who saw it get approved once and didn't see construction, basically construction had to stop.
What is fascinating with this announcement, and parenthesis, my ex-cynical MP side is kind of going with a big oof today, because I was still to the last minute thinking that the Liberals might come up with some type of rabbit in the hat and find other ways to delay. And no, they went head on because they had bought the pipelines. It would have sounded a bit ridiculous and would have looked so much political. So now they have that pipeline, they give it the go-ahead. There's already been a lot of consultation. Otherwise, they would have not been able to give their go-ahead light there. What is amazing, Vashi, is that from everything I read in the last half hour, they seem to have unified pretty much everybody against their go-ahead thing. I already see the Bloc's position in Quebec trying to paint themselves like the only real people who will defend environment, and this is a hypocrite prime minister, and so on and so forth. The only thing I thought that lacked from the press conference from the Prime Minister was the details on a very important factor, which is an interesting concept in my point of view of letting the resource flow like Alberta wants, and help jobs in that aspect, and at the same time, with the revenues that the federal government is going to make, be able to address the issues of phasing out a resource that, except for certain people, inside ourselves, there's not many things, we're not all specialists in environment, but we do know that we have to change this, but it won't happen tomorrow. So that was an interesting concept that might shut down all the progressive or environmentalists very to the left if they come up with a specific plan. But there were no years, no dates, no exactly what do they mean by that. But a lot of details to come.
Stockwell, I think what Françoise is referring to is the announcement today, which was kind of the new part of this approval. We had been expecting the approval considering they originally bought the pipeline, but they said that all of the revenue generated by the pipeline, and I think Bill Morneau at one point said it could be, once it's up and running, up to $500 million a year, and any profit potentially generated by the sale of the pipeline would then be reinvested in some kind of green technology fund or fund that gets you away from conventional energy. Like Françoise said, there weren't a lot of details provided today. Do you think that works to allay some of the concerns that people opposed to the pipeline have, or will it kind of fall on deaf ears?
I actually think it will help, and I'm not saying it's a good or bad policy. As Premier Kenney said, that's for the federal government to decide, so I think it will help. But where the federal Liberals are being especially insightful here, in fact, they know, I mean, it says, oh, all these parties are lined up against them now and it's going to hurt them. Actually, it's not, because all polling shows that when you ask Canadians about pipeline and about natural resources, and you talk about a project and you say, if it passes the various requirements, and if there is agreement, And if it's not going to be overall harmful to the environment, do you agree? And most Canadians say, let's go ahead with it if it meets those tests. So in fact, what the Prime Minister has seized on is exactly as we've said here for a number of months right on this show, it does pass the test. It is going to help other countries reduce their emissions. It is going to vastly help the First Nations group who are dependent and who love the environment as much as anybody. I think you're also going to see a shift in Quebec because we always hear that Quebecers they're opposed to Energy East. In fact, the polling shows clearly that especially outside of Montreal, there isn't opposition to these pipelines. As a matter of fact, there are MPs from Quebec and MPs from Alberta who are sort of collaborating together on getting the message across. I think this is going to be helpful in terms of the overall understanding, and the point that Premier Kenney made today is very important, that over the last 10 years, just the ability to reduce emissions to produce a barrel of oil, that's decreased by 20%. There'll be another 20% decrease in oil and gas production in the next 10 years. So this alarmist message that some in the Prime Minister's cabinet, Minister McKenna being one, that we've only got 10 years to live, it's not working. In fact, people are not buying it, and it's making them more open to the other side of the argument.
Look, to pick up on one thing you said, Graham, that Stockwell said, this idea that the Liberals are seizing on the idea that there are a lot of people in this country who care about the environment but also see the merits of this particular pipeline. You could really hear that in this almost cementing of their messaging today. They keep talking, and in the past few months, they've really sort of said the NDP only cares about the environment, the Conservatives only care about the economy. We're the only party to tackle that middle ground.
Yeah, this is what they're trying to do, of course, is find a balance between the economy and the environment. If you go back, the majority of Canadians, it seems, are in favor of the pipeline because they understand that it's going to help the economy of Alberta and the entire country. And something else the Liberals have done in terms of approving the pipeline today, you go back 2.5 years ago when they first gave conditional approval. That was Trudeau was praising Alberta under the NDP government and Rachel Notley for bringing in the Climate Leadership Plan, which included a cap on emissions from the oil sands and a carbon tax. Well, you fast forward this year, of course, Kenney won the election. He has scrapped the Alberta carbon tax. So all of a sudden you're wondering, well, how could the Liberals then approve the pipeline? Of course, they announced last week that they'll be imposing a carbon tax on Alberta next year. So that's one condition met. As for the cap on emissions, Kenney, who was not a fan of the cap on emissions, is now saying the cap's a moot point. It's 100 million tons is the cap. Right now, we're about 70 million tons a year emissions from the oil sands. So we've got a long way to go. So he's not fighting for that cap to be removed. So those two conditions have been met in the Liberals' eyes. So that's why they could actually go ahead and approve this and also say we're trying to protect the environment as well. So this is sort of a balancing act. I think they've done a pretty good job because most, I guess, Canadians want the pipeline to go ahead. 60% apparently in British Columbia approve of the Trans Mountain Pipeline going ahead. But there's also this idea of protecting the environment. So the Liberals are saying, look, we can do both. And they've got the Conservatives too far on one side on the economy. The NDP is all about the environment. And they're trying to find a sweet spot in the middle. And I think today actually helped them do that. And it's not going to help them in Alberta, but it's going to help them in the rest of the country, I think.
All right, I have to, sorry to interrupt, Tim. First, I'm just going to head over to the National Press Theatre because NDP leader Jagmeet Singh is reacting to that decision. Let's take a listen in for a few moments.
For the marine diversity, for the biodiversity, and for the thousands of jobs that depend on the coastlines. This is deeply concerning, particularly given that those environmental concerns aren't addressed still. They remain to be addressed. And finally, because the Indigenous concerns that were raised are still present, the fact that the decision was made before the consultations occurred, that is not meaningful in terms of consultations when the decision has been predetermined before meeting with the people impacted. Those concerns continue. We have opposed this project, believe it is harmful to the coastline, harmful to people, harmful to workers, and is not good for the province of BC or for Canada. Donc, on a déjà mentionné notre opposition de ce projet. Ça va être un projet qui va être quelque chose.
We expressed our opposition to this project, which is going to be very bad for workers because a bitumen spill is something that we cannot resolve. We have no evidence proving that we will know what to do with that. It threatens biodiversity. It is something that is very dangerous, and it will threaten our stance with regard to greenhouse gas emissions reduction. So we continue to oppose this project, and we will work hard with a strong voice in opposition to this.
Additional voices from my caucus, Alexander Boudouris and Peter Julian will add additional comments on behalf of our caucus on the perspectives of the environment and the fiscal viability of this project.
Merci. Merci, Jagmeet. Merci tout le monde.
Thank you, everyone. I believe that we have a decision here that surprises no one.
That was federal NDP leader Jagmeet Singh addressing the government's decision to approve the TMX pipeline. We're standing by with the power panel. I've got Tim Murphy, Françoise Boivin, Graham Thompson, and Stockwell Day. Tim, why don't I pick up with you again? So not a surprise from the NDP. They have long been in opposition to this pipeline, very specifically so. Perhaps a bit of a potential issue for them going forward is the LNG project in BC. A lot of people saying, well, you're very clear on TMX, but not as much so on LNG.
Yeah, so I think we will find. Well, to be fair, I think there is always that tension between the environment and economy in our country, and in part because we have real regional differences about where both those economic resources are and the environmental challenges are. And I think the NDP are going to see that same problem. I think we're going to see the NDP migrate even further left over the course of the next months, especially, given we're seeing polling that has the NDP trailing the Green parties in some numbers. And so I suspect we'll see Mr. Singh move even more aggressively to the left. Whether that means they move against some other projects as well, we'll have to see. I think I was going to say just before the break, one thing that really surprised me in the Andrew Scheer's positioning on this was he adopted that radical environmentalist language in terms of people who were opposing the pipeline, the TMX pipeline, and adopted that sort of really kind of some of the harder edged rhetoric out of the oil patch, especially among some of the smaller producers, which I just find that surprising because I think.
What's an example of that? Do you mean?
Well, he talked about how there was, this opposition to the pipeline, and that Justin Trudeau was, kind of aligning himself with the radical environmentalists and that language around foreign influence and all of those examples. And I just thought, there was an opportunity for Andrew Scheer to be prime ministerial in this context, and I think he's adopted a rhetoric and a positioning that actually puts him out on the right flank of his own party. And actually, in comparison to actually the way I thought Premier Kenney positioned Alberta, there was a strong leader and a weak leader comparison where Andrew Scheer did not look positive in the comparison.
It's interesting, Françoise. I mean, that would be based, I guess, on your observations on the press conferences. In the past, Premier Kenney has used a lot of that rhetoric, though. He's starting the war room, for example, talks about foreign influence all the time.
Yeah, and the problem for all the Canadians listening right now is that I'm sure they're all mixed up, and it's all a question of credibility. And every political parties are going to have a challenge on the issue of environment, even if climate change, environment becomes the ballot question. The more I hear one and the other, because sometimes one day I listen to one of the leader and I'm thinking, oh, that's Elizabeth May plus. Or then I'm like, oh, no, the Prime Minister sounds like past Mr. Scheer. It's so confusing for most people because, and it's, I go back to the CBC survey. You had a great survey. I was reading this today and hearing Eric Grenier talk about it on the issue of environment and climate change and where Canadians stand from coast to coast to coast. And it's like, we're all for virtue, but at the same time, it's in the details. So it might well be the ballot question. But from what we're hearing from every political party, there's not much to really digest the topic and know exactly what they would be doing on the 22nd of October. So on the day after a emergency climate change motion, you get the Trudeau government who arrives and green light the TMX. You've got Andrew Scheer tomorrow going to give us his policy on environment. I mean, if that's not enough to make all your mind spin and see within all these big phrases and sentences that will be grabbed by different medias and played with ad nauseam during the campaign, I'm not sure that will be more advanced. So it's very hard to understand everything.
Yeah, a couple interesting things, Stockwell, that Francoise touched on. The first is that, of course, last night there was a declaration of a climate emergency, a motion passed. MPs other than the Conservatives supported it. Then the day after, a lot of people noting that after championing that motion, a day after the Liberals approved this. Also, that survey that Eric Grenier has been reporting on, that basically showed there's an overwhelming desire in Canada to do something about climate change, but that only half of Canadians polled said that they would actually be willing to pay $100 to do so. So, like, if you ask them to pay the amount they pay for Netflix each month, they're kind of hesitant to do so, which I wonder what kind of implications, when you take all that together, that has for a party like the Conservatives, is trying to figure out what their climate policy is going to be and finally going to announce it tomorrow.
Well, I agree with Francoise that credibility is going to be the issue here, and that was, I don't want to say laughable, I don't want to laugh at my colleagues in the House Commons, but one day it's an emergency and we're all dead imminently if we don't do something right now, and the next day you announce the pipeline, which we've all said is, I think, a good announcement, and it's environmentally sensitive. Credibility is going to be an issue. I do think the Prime Minister will run into credibility on the carbon tax because it was put in at $20 per ton. And by 2022, it's going to be 50, but the environmental officer out of the House of Commons has just come out and said, oh man, it's got to be like over 100.
The PBO.
If the Liberals, if the Liberals want to make their goal. And there is no Canadian who's going to pay that kind of amount. But added to this, it's not just that Canadians are only watching their wallets. They're just not buying into this whole aspect that we're all going to be dead in a few years. And the Liberals have not been able to demonstrate how, in fact, carbon tax is going to help reduce emissions. The other thing, just closing with this thought, that is going to be credibility for the Prime Minister, he completely I thought it was a great announcement. He could have got partisan support, and then he completely launched into an attack on the Harper years, saying no pipelines were built. I was there when when Line 67 was put in. That's 1,200 kilometers of pipeline that was built, exporting 800,000 barrels a day. I was there when the Southern Lights pipeline was built, 2010. That's, in fact, 2,500 kilometers of pipeline going to Illinois. I was there when the Anchor Loop was approved. That's 160 kilometers right through Jasper Park, highly sensitive with no problems. And, of course, the big one with TransCanada's Keystone project, 4,000 kilometers going to Alaska.
I mean, we hear this debate between the two parties all the time, right?
Right.
I mean, the Harper government got nothing approved to Tidewater, and then the people from that government say, hey, there were 4 pipelines, and I think the one you're referencing specifically is the Anchor Loop, though it wasn't, the implication of it was not a major difference in the amount able to export, in the same vein of TMX.
Yeah, it does tie into Trans Mountain, but it shows that the credibility is going to be the issue. He's going to have to drop that line about no pipelines being built because they were, in fact. And I think moving towards this, as we're seeing more and more in politics generally, those who can come out with, the leaders who come out with the facts and stay positive, yes, of course, criticize your adversary where they're absolutely wrong. That's where it's going to sway in terms of opinion.
Graham, final word to you.
Yeah, it's interesting watching Scheer's rhetoric. Sounds a lot like Jason Kenney. And I think that the federal Conservatives are actually watching what actually happened in Alberta, of course, with Kenney, his language, the radical environmentalists, the carbon tax was forcing people not to heat their homes, even though, of course, people who are in lower income got a rebate in Alberta, and people will be getting rebates, of course, federally. But still, it's like 2015, you had the NDP won the election in Alberta. The Liberals took a lot of lessons from that in terms of their sunny ways in their campaign. This time around, the Conservatives win in Alberta. Federally, they're taking the same kind of notes from Kenney this time in terms of how to demonize your opponents, how to attack environmentalists. People who are opposed to the pipeline are against Canada. and how to simplify things to a point to me as being very cynical politics, but it was very effective for Kenny. The difference is, though, the Alberta economy was languishing with a major recession, and federally the economy is doing quite well. So that's one of the things that the Trudeau government has going for it. And I think that today's announcement, even though it may get some pushback from environmentalists, I think overall it's probably more positive, again, outside of Alberta, more positive to the Prime Minister than negative.
All right, I'll leave it there. Thank you, everyone, on the Power Panel tonight. Thanks so much to Françoise Boivin, Tim Murphy, Graham Thompson, and Stockwell Day.
We listened very carefully to the concerns from the communities. We offered extensive, meaningful accommodations, and the way we responded to NEB 16 recommendations will help us deal with many of the issues that communities have identified, and we are satisfied that we have discharged our duty to consult with Indigenous communities.
Welcome back to Power and Politics. We're coming to you from Parliament Hill today. It's a green light for the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion again. Earlier, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and his cabinet announced that they are approving the project for a second time. A federal court had originally thrown out the first approval, arguing in part that the government did not meaningfully consult Indigenous groups. This time, the Prime Minister says they listened and they will act on what they heard from those groups, promising far more Indigenous engagement in the project. Charlene Alec of Tsleil-Waututh is a liaison for the Sacred Trust Initiative. She joins us now via FaceTime from Vancouver. Hi there. Thank you so much for making time for us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So you heard the minister there, Amarjeet Sohi, say that they feel they have discharged their duty to consult, that essentially they have complied with what the court said, they have had meaningful consultation. What do you think?
Yeah, through the federal court appeal decision that came down, they had said that the Crown must do consultation differently, and we at Tsleil-Waututh found that there was no time given adequately to have a fulsome conversation about our concerns and our risks that we feel about this project.
What are some of your concerns? I'll get to the question around time in a moment, but could you sort of outline for us what the concerns are about this pipeline expansion?
Well, mainly is through the consultation, we wanted to really have our voice heard about the risks that this project bears on the inlet, not just the pipeline and then the holding tanks on land. It's the shipping and the marine shipping. It's not in our backyard, it's in our thing, because we got most of our diet, 90% of our diet from the inlet. And Indigenous women and community, we've tried hard to steward the land and the water and take care of the waters, clam beds, and cleaning up the inlet possible. We know we can't get it back to its natural state, but we try hard, and it is taking a notice because the whale are back.
Unfortunately, our connection is not really good, so we're missing out on some of what you're saying. I just want to ask you a final question, though. When you say that you didn't feel that you got adequate time, that the consultation was not adequate, what kind of time did the government give you? How much time did they spend listening to your concerns, and why do you feel it's not enough?
Through the first round of consultation, when you make a big decision about something like that, we saw the risks, with our own bare eyes across the inlet, and we see the shipping tanks come in. But in order to make a big decision like that, we got the professionals and the scientists, the biologists, to prove what we know in our heart, risk for our people, and the inlet water and the land. And given such a short period of time, did not answer our concern.
And what can you do, I guess, to continue the opposition? What mechanisms do you have available? Are you prepared to go to court, that kind of thing?
I just stepped off the stage. Our nation is standing with other friends and allies and relatives at this press conference here in Vancouver, along with the mayor of Vancouver, Our chief had just spoke just before I stepped off and said that we will be looking at appealing this in the Federal Court of Appeal.
Okay, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your time. I really appreciate it. Thanks to Charlene Alec of Tsleil-Waututh. And we're going to head over now. I believe Elizabeth May, leader of the federal Green Party, is giving her reaction to this decision from the federal government to reapprove the TMX pipeline expansion. Let's take a listen into what she has to say.
From climate change effects.
That we're in a climate emergency. We talked about what it means to hold to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, the urgency of that. We talked about the fact that the current target in which the Government of Canada is operating is completely inconsistent with holding to no more than 1.5 Celsius global average temperature increase. It needs to be said that for what Prime Minister Trudeau put forward today to work, he's betting against Paris working. There's no way to build an additional pipeline, more fossil fuel infrastructure for exporting raw bitumen out of this country. There's no way that works without expanding the oil sands. He admitted as much in his response to you when he said, well, within our Paris goals, we have a cap on the Alberta oil sands. It can't be said often enough or loudly enough that when Justin Trudeau or Catherine McKenna talk about their Paris targets, they are not talking about what we agreed to do in Paris. The Paris Agreement, the treaty, is clearly about holding global average temperature increase to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius and as far below 2 degrees as possible. The information around which we first debated that we had an emergency motion October 15th in Parliament in response to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. What that report told us that we didn't know in Paris was that 2 degrees is far too dangerous. That at 2 degrees we risk going into, well, past tipping points that lead us into self-accelerating, unstoppable, runaway global warming that undermines the very foundations of human civilization and leads to the extinction of millions of species. The IPCC report was hopeful in that it told us it's not too late. You can hold global emissions to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, but not on our current trajectory. It calls on us to go off fossil fuels 100% by 2050 and use dramatically less by 2030. Justin Trudeau's much vaunted cap on oil sands emissions, which was agreed to with Rachel Notley, so who knows if it has any status with Jason Kenney, involves an increase in emissions in the oil sands. Far from cutting emissions, it goes from 70 megatons a year with a cap at 100 megatons a year. I think what made me so angry was the cynicism of the bait and switch that every dollar that we make on this pipeline will go to green energy projects. Where are the dollars coming from to build the pipeline that we object to so strenuously in British Columbia? They come from our own public resources. This is public money, $10 to $13 billion additional on top of the $4.5 billion they already squandered buying a 65-year-old pipeline. They will build a pipeline to blow through our Paris targets, use our own money to do it, and then try to trick us by saying every dollar made on this project, as if there's ever going to be a profit, that's another question, is going to go to clean energy projects.
Clearly, we are now in an urgent climate situation. I have absolutely no idea why Mr.
And that is Green Party leader Elizabeth May responding to the federal government's decision to reapprove the TMX pipeline expansion. She's speaking to reporters over at the National Press Theatre here in Ottawa. The main gist of her argument is that approving the pipeline flies in the face of the rhetoric from the federal government on fighting climate change, and that essentially approving the pipeline will blow through the Paris targets. Those are the targets set, of course, to reduce carbon emissions by the year 2030 by a certain percentage, 30% below 2005 levels. She is not happy with this decision, and she made that very clear.
Although I regret the federal government's decision, it is within their authority to make that decision. It's now up to George and I and the Governor of British Columbia to make sure as this project proceeds We have no impacts on our marine life, we have no impact on our natural environment, and we do not put at risk one of the hottest economies in the country, an economy that's working for all British Columbians, not just a select few.
That was BC Premier John Horgan reacting to the decision today from the federal government to reapprove the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion. A federal court rejected the federal government's first approval, saying that the review of the project was partly flawed. There's a lot riding on the decision politically and economically, just as we near a fall federal election. Here's a sampling of the reaction from today's announcement.
Fundamentally, this isn't a choice between producing more conventional energy or less. It's a choice about where we can sell it and how we get it there safely.
I doubt his sincerity because he hasn't actually done anything. I mean, show me the pipeline. Where is it? He announced last year that it would be operating this year.
We have opposed this project, believe it is harmful to the coastline, harmful to people, harmful to workers, and is not good for the province of BC or for Canada.
They will build a pipeline to blow through our Paris targets, use our own money to do it, and then try to trick us by saying every dollar made on this project, as if there's ever going to be a profit, that's another question, is going to go to clean energy projects.
But this second approval of the Trans Mountain pipeline isn't a victory to celebrate. It's just another step in a process that has frankly taken too long. So we're happy with today's decision, but now let's get it built.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video. Thanks for watching.